It's strange how certain stories don't feel like they were created, but like they were uncovered, as if they were already there, buried under layers of time, waiting for someone to accidentally dig too deep and realize they were never meant to be found. History has a way of doing that, not always forgetting things by accident, but sometimes setting them aside with intention, as though someone decided long ago that the truth was too heavy, too strange, or too dangerous to remain in plain sight. And what makes it even more unsettling is that these buried pieces don't always stay buried. Sometimes they resurface in fragments, scattered across unrelated places, written by people who never met, never shared purpose, and yet somehow describe the same impossible shape of something that should not exist. What follows is built from such fragments. A weathered field journal recovered decades after it was written. A letter that was never meant for preservation, written by someone who clearly regretted writing it the moment the ink dried. An illegal deposition filed under a false identity, structured carefully enough to avoid responsibility while still preserving truth in the only way its author felt safe to express it. Taken separately, each document feels incomplete. Taken together, they form something far more uncomfortable than a mystery. They form recognition. The story begins in 1840, deep in the southern region of Missouri, in the Ozark Hills, a landscape that does not behave like the dramatic wilderness most people imagine when they think of untamed land. There are no towering peaks announcing themselves against the sky, no endless deserts stretching into abstraction. Instead, there are rolling hills layered one after another like folded fabric, dense forests that seem to absorb sound rather than reflect it, and narrow creeks that cut through stone with a patience that suggests they have always been there and always will be. The people who lived in that region understood the land in a way that was not entirely spoken. They knew which valleys felt normal and which did not. They knew which stretches of forest animals avoided without obvious reason, and which areas felt subtly wrong even in daylight. These weren't superstitions in the way outsiders would label them. They were observations passed quietly between generations, never formalized, never written into official records, but understood all the same. Because naming something like that would give it attention, and attention was something the locals instinctively avoided giving. In the small settlement of Calder's Crossing, life continued in its usual rhythm. It was a modest town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names but rarely spoke about anything beyond necessity. Farms stretched outward from its edges, trade passed through slowly, and news from larger cities arrived late enough to already feel outdated. It was here, in this unremarkable setting, that a survey expedition was assembled in the spring of 1840. The purpose was simple: to map a large section of wilderness that had recently drawn the interest of businessmen in St. Louis. There was talk of land value, resources, expansion, progress, the usual language of expansion that rarely accounts for what already exists in the places being measured. The expedition was led by a man named Elias Croft. Elias was not the kind of man who believed in mysteries. His life was built on measurement, structure, and verification. He trusted what could be seen, recorded, and confirmed. Everything else, in his view, was noise waiting to be resolved into data. He had spent years working across difficult terrain, mountain regions, swamps, undeveloped stretches of land, where survival required discipline more than intuition. Through all of it, he had maintained the same belief, that the world, no matter how chaotic it appeared on the surface, would eventually yield to careful documentation. He was not a reckless man. He was not easily shaken, and perhaps that is what makes what happened to him later so difficult to dismiss. His team was assembled with practicality in mind. There was Dr. Harlan Voss, a physician who had spent years treating injuries and illnesses in rural conditions where medicine often meant improvisation rather than certainty. He had the steady patience of someone who had long accepted that not everything can be fixed, but most things can at least be endured. There was Tatum, an older guide from the Ozarks, a man who spoke rarely but observed constantly, whose understanding of the land seemed less like learned knowledge and more like something absorbed over time through proximity. And there was Wesley Pruitt, a young assistant whose openness and constant curiosity made him the most verbally present member of the group. Someone who filled silence without thinking about it, as if silence itself made him slightly uneasy. They left Calder's Crossing in mid-April. The weather was stable, the air mild, and the forest at the edge of spring, green returning slowly, light filtering through branches in long, soft angles. For the first few days, everything proceeded as expected. Elias took measurements, logged terrain changes, marked distances with precision. Dr. Voss observed quietly, occasionally noting environmental conditions. Wesley talked often, sometimes about nothing important, sometimes about whatever came into his mind at the moment. Even Tatum, who usually stayed ahead of the group, gave no indication that anything was unusual. But the land began to change in ways that were not immediately obvious. It wasn't something that could be pointed at directly. It was not a sudden event or dramatic shift. Instead, it was a gradual removal of certainty. Birdsong became less frequent, though never fully absent. The forest seemed denser even when the trees themselves had not changed. Light filtered differently, no longer feeling directional but diffused, as though it were being absorbed before reaching the ground. Even sound behaved strangely. Water still flowed, wind still moved through branches, but the overall impression of the forest was quieter in a way that was difficult to measure. Elias noted all of this, though he did not assign meaning to it. He rarely did. His journal remained factual, observational, careful. On the 5th day, they crossed deeper into what locals referred to, without formal name, as the deeper hollow region. That was when the first real disturbance occurred. Not something loud or dramatic, but something subtle enough that it could have been dismissed under normal circumstances. It began at night. Wesley woke the camp, not in panic, but in a controlled voice that immediately drew attention. He said something was outside the camp. The men responded quickly, moving through the darkness with lanterns, searching the perimeter. Nothing was found. No tracks, no broken brush, no sign of intrusion. Yet Wesley remained certain that something had been there. Elias initially recorded it as fatigue or misinterpretation. But later, while reviewing the area alone, he noticed something that he could not so easily dismiss. The nearby creek, which had been audible earlier in the evening, had fallen completely silent. Not reduced in volume, not distant, but entirely absent of sound, despite still visibly flowing. He stood there longer than necessary, trying to reconcile perception with expectation. Eventually, he wrote in his journal that he had no explanation and that he would continue to observe. But observation, in that moment, felt less like study and more like waiting. The next day, they moved deeper still, and the sense of imbalance increased. Distances no longer felt reliable. Paths that should have been straightforward began to shift in subtle ways. The compass still functioned, but its usefulness began to feel questionable, not because it was broken, but because the environment no longer seemed consistent with its assumptions. Then they found the clearing. It was not large. It did not stand out in any obvious way except for what was inside it. Stones, arranged deliberately, in a structure that clearly indicated intention. They were not randomly placed. They were positioned with care, forming a pattern that Elias immediately recognized as meaningful even though he could not interpret its meaning. Dr. Voss confirmed that the stones had been worked, shaped in ways that suggested tool use rather than natural erosion. Tatum, upon seeing them, did not react with surprise. Instead, he reacted with recognition. When asked if he had seen anything like it before, he hesitated only briefly before describing a similar arrangement from years earlier, in another part of the region. In that case, he said, men had camped near it despite warnings. By morning, 2 of them had left the camp without explanation. They were later found alive, but changed in ways that he could not properly define. Not injured, not lost, changed. Elias recorded everything. Even as he did, something in him began to shift, not belief, not disbelief, but a growing awareness that the categories he normally relied on were no longer sufficient to describe what he was encountering. That night, he wrote something in his journal that he would not normally write, that he did not believe the explanation, but that he believed the man who gave it. And that distinction, for the first time in his career, felt dangerously important. After the clearing with the stones, the expedition did not immediately descend into chaos or fear, but something more subtle and far more difficult to name began to settle over the group, a gradual reordering of attention that none of them discussed openly, but all of them began to participate in unconsciously. The forest itself remained visually unchanged in most ways. Trees still stood in their familiar density. The terrain still followed its natural slopes and ridges, and yet the experience of moving through it began to lose its predictability, as if the land was no longer responding with the same consistency it had before. Conversations among the men became noticeably shorter without any single decision to make them so, not because they had nothing to say, but because speaking seemed to require more effort than before, as though words had to travel further to reach meaning. Wesley, who had previously filled silence with casual curiosity and light commentary about everything from weather to distant towns, began to fall into longer and longer stretches of quiet, speaking only when necessary, and even then with a kind of hesitation that had not been present earlier in the journey. Dr. Voss, whose role required observation more than interpretation, found himself watching the men rather than the landscape more frequently, not out of suspicion, but out of a growing sense that people were changing in ways that could not be fully explained by fatigue or stress alone. Tatum remained outwardly steady, as he had from the beginning, but his stillness had taken on a deeper quality, as if his pauses between movement were no longer simply moments of thought, but moments of listening to something that existed just beyond the range of ordinary awareness. Elias, meanwhile, continued to do what he had always done, which was to record, measure, and structure his experience into something that could be reviewed later. But even in his journal, a subtle shift was beginning to appear, not in abandonment of logic, but in the increasing presence of notes that acknowledged the limits of logic in the conditions they were encountering. As they moved deeper into the Ozark interior, the land began to behave less like a stable environment and more like a system that was subtly resisting full comprehension. It was not that the terrain changed in dramatic or immediately visible ways, but rather that its reliability began to weaken in small, cumulative inconsistencies that only became apparent when reflected upon. Distances that should have taken a predictable amount of time to cross occasionally felt shorter or longer than expected without any obvious reason in terrain or pace. Paths that had been traversed earlier in the day sometimes felt slightly unfamiliar when revisited, not because they were physically different, but because the sense of certainty attached to them seemed to have shifted. Even navigation, which Elias had trusted implicitly for years, began to feel less absolute, as though directional indicators were still functioning mechanically but no longer aligning perfectly with the experience of movement. The compass itself remained accurate in a technical sense, but its meaning began to feel less reliable when compared to the increasingly inconsistent environment it was being used to interpret. On the 7th day of the expedition, they encountered the cabin, though even that moment carried a sense of gradual emergence rather than sudden discovery, as though the structure had not simply been found, but had slowly revealed itself through proximity. At first, it was only a suggestion of geometry among the trees, a break in the organic pattern of the forest that did not fully resolve until they were close enough to recognize its shape as a human-made structure. The cabin was small, constructed from timber that had aged significantly, its surface darkened by time and exposure, partially overtaken by vegetation that had grown around it in a way that suggested long-term abandonment rather than recent desertion. The roof had sagged slightly under accumulated weight and decay, but the structure itself still held together, intact in a way that implied it had not been violently disturbed, only left behind and slowly reclaimed by its surroundings. There were no signs of recent human activity, no smoke from a hearth, no tracks indicating frequent passage, no tools or supplies left in visible reach, and yet the cabin did not feel entirely absent of presence. Instead, it carried a quality that was difficult to describe without contradiction, as though whatever had once occupied it had not fully ceased to exist in relation to it. Inside, the air was immediately distinct from the surrounding forest, not in a way that suggested freshness or decay in the usual sense, but in a way that suggested isolation from time. It felt as though the interior space had been separated from normal atmospheric change for an extended period, as if air itself had remained in place without the usual cycles of renewal or disturbance. The cabin contained a single main room, sparsely arranged with remnants of furniture that had long since lost functional relevance. But what dominated the space was not what remained physically, but what had been inscribed onto every available surface. Walls, floorboards, and even portions of the ceiling were covered in writing, applied in a dense, deliberate manner that left no significant surface untouched. These markings were not random scratches or fragmented symbols, but structured forms that suggested consistency, repetition, and internal rules governing their formation. Elias immediately began documenting them, copying as much as he could into his journal, though it became clear within minutes that the system of writing did not correspond to any known language, script, or symbolic tradition he had ever encountered. It was not simply unfamiliar, but resistant to recognition, as if it existed entirely outside the frameworks used to categorize written communication. Dr. Voss examined portions of the structure and concluded that the writing had been produced over time rather than in a single instance, based on layering patterns and variations in pressure and material application. This implied prolonged occupation or repeated return to the same location over an extended period, a detail that introduced a level of continuity that conflicted with the apparent abandonment of the structure. The question of who had produced the writing remained unanswered, but the consistency suggested a single originating source or a unified system maintained with deliberate persistence. Tatum did not enter the cabin immediately. Instead, he remained positioned outside, observing the surrounding forest rather than the structure itself, his attention directed toward the tree line beyond it in a way that suggested he was expecting movement or change that had not yet occurred. When Elias asked what he was looking at, Tatum responded simply that it was nothing yet, a phrase that did not imply absence but anticipation, as though whatever he was aware of had not yet fully arrived or revealed itself in a form that could be directly observed. That night, the expedition made camp at a distance from the cabin without discussion or disagreement, as if proximity alone had become something to be managed carefully. The fire was maintained at a larger size than usual, not for comfort, but for psychological reassurance, and the men naturally positioned themselves closer to it than they had on previous nights. Conversation remained minimal and strictly functional, focused on practical considerations such as travel direction, weather conditions, and supply status. But beneath these exchanges, there was an unspoken recognition that the environment they were moving through was no longer behaving in a way that matched their expectations of wilderness. Elias continued writing throughout the night, his entries remaining structured and observational in tone, yet increasingly containing reflections that acknowledged a growing sense of instability in the framework he was using to interpret events. He noted that the land no longer felt passive, that it no longer behaved like an environment being traversed, but instead gave the impression of something that was aware of being traversed, though he did not define what form that awareness might take or how it could be confirmed. The sensation, as he recorded it, was not fear in the conventional sense, but a persistent awareness of observation without identifiable source. By the morning of the 8th day, the sense of inconsistency had deepened further. Movement through the forest required more conscious effort, not physically, but cognitively, as if the environment no longer aligned smoothly with expectation. The reliability of terrain features began to feel diminished, not through obvious alteration, but through subtle shifts in how they were experienced. Tatum walked ahead more frequently now, stopping at intervals that were becoming increasingly regular, standing completely still with his attention fixed on directions that held no visible difference from any other part of the forest. When questioned, he did not offer clear explanations, only indicating that something was moving parallel to them, maintaining distance while following the same general progression through the landscape. Elias recorded this without immediate dismissal, though internally he struggled to reconcile the statement with any model of behavior that made sense within his understanding of movement, tracking, or environmental interaction. That night, the animals became unsettled without gradual buildup, reacting suddenly and simultaneously as if triggered by an unseen presence. The mules pulled against their restraints with force that exceeded their usual patterns of stress response, and their behavior suggested acute distress without visible cause. As the men moved to stabilize them, a sound emerged from the forest below the ridge, initially indistinct but quickly resolving into structured repetition. It was the sound of footsteps, evenly spaced, deliberate in timing, and consistent in rhythm. The spacing between impacts did not match human gait or any known animal movement pattern the men could identify. Elias found himself instinctively counting the intervals, attempting to impose structure on the sound, but the pattern resisted categorization. The movement maintained a fixed trajectory along the base of the ridge, neither approaching nor retreating, maintaining distance with deliberate consistency, as though its path had been set independently of observation. It continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly, not fading or diminishing, but ceasing entirely, as though the decision to stop had been made with intent rather than limitation. No one slept after that event, and by morning, the ground below showed no indication that anything had passed at all. By the time the expedition entered its final stretch, there was no longer any sense that they were moving through a neutral landscape that could be mapped, measured, and exited in a predictable manner. The forest still existed in physical form, still held trees, ridges, soil, and water, but the reliability of those elements as navigational anchors had begun to fail in ways that were no longer subtle. What had started as small inconsistencies in distance and direction had evolved into something far more persistent, a structural collapse in the relationship between movement and outcome. No matter how carefully Elias recalculated bearings, no matter how often he confirmed compass readings or cross-checked terrain markers, the result of travel no longer aligned with expectation. Paths walked with absolute certainty would still return them to familiar locations that should have been impossible to reach again without deliberate reversal. It was not that they were lost in the traditional sense. It was that the concept of a way itself had begun to lose structural meaning within the space they were moving through. The group had already diminished without clear explanation of how or when it had become smaller. Fitch had vanished first, leaving no trace. Then others followed in the same pattern, each disappearance lacking any sign of struggle, direction, or cause that could be verified through observation. What remained was not a panicked group, but a structurally unstable one, held together more by procedure than by confidence in outcome. Elias continued to document everything, though even his entries began to shift subtly in tone, no longer purely observational, but increasingly reflective of an underlying recognition that the system he was recording might not operate according to rules he understood. It was on what would later be identified as the 13th day that the most significant transformation began to take shape within one of the remaining men, though at first it did not present itself as transformation at all. Aldous, who had previously been one of the quieter members of the group, known more for endurance than expression, began to exhibit a change that was not immediately alarming in isolation, but became disturbing in repetition. It started with sound, a low, continuous humming that he did not appear to initiate intentionally. It was not singing, not speech, and not a recognizable vocalization pattern associated with fatigue or stress. It simply occurred, as if something within him had settled into a steady resonance that no longer required conscious control. At first, the others assumed it was exhaustion or psychological strain manifesting in an unusual way, but the consistency of the sound made it increasingly difficult to dismiss. The hum did not fluctuate with emotion, movement, or conversation. It remained constant, low, and rhythmic, as if synchronized with something external rather than internal. When questioned, Aldous did not appear confused or defensive. He acknowledged questions normally, responded appropriately when spoken to, and yet the hum persisted beneath everything, uninterrupted, as though it were not interfering with his awareness but existing alongside it in a parallel layer of perception. Elias noted this carefully in his journal, not yet assigning meaning, but recognizing deviation from expected behavioral baselines. Dr. Voss examined Aldous physically and found no immediate neurological or physiological explanation for the change. There was no sign of injury, infection, or visible impairment. Cognitive responses remained intact. Coordination remained stable. And yet something about his presence had altered in a way that resisted classification. That night, Aldous stood without warning. There was no indication beforehand that he intended to move. He simply rose from his position near the fire and began walking. When Elias spoke to him, Aldous paused. He turned, and in that moment, those who saw him later described something that was not fear, but recognition mixed with something closer to calm. His expression was not empty. It was focused in a way that suggested alignment with something beyond the immediate environment. When asked where he was going, he did not answer in a conventional sense. He simply looked toward the forest with the same steady attention he had been carrying beneath the hum. as if the question itself was already contained within the direction he was facing. Elias stepped in front of him. Aldous stopped without resistance. For a moment, both men stood in silence, and according to Elias's later account, that silence did not feel neutral. It felt structured, as if it had weight. Then Aldous smiled, not in a way that suggested humor or emotion in the normal sense, but in a way that suggested confirmation, as if something he had been waiting for had finally aligned correctly. After that, he turned, walked back to his bedroll, and lay down. The hum did not stop, but his awareness appeared to withdraw from immediate interaction, even while his body remained responsive. By morning, Aldous had no memory of leaving his position, nor of the interaction that had occurred. He responded normally when questioned. He ate. He moved. He spoke when necessary. But the hum continued beneath everything, unchanged, and those who observed him closely noted that his attention seemed slightly displaced, as though part of his awareness was no longer anchored fully within the visible environment. On the same day, Elias made an entry in his journal that marked a shift in tone that was no longer purely observational. He wrote that the pattern of events was no longer random, that the disappearances, the environmental inconsistencies, and the behavioral changes were forming a structure that he could not yet fully interpret but could no longer dismiss as isolated anomalies. He noted that whatever was occurring did not appear to be acting with urgency or aggression, but with patience, a form of patience that suggested long-term observation rather than immediate interaction. By the 14th day, attempts to leave the area had become repetitive and increasingly futile. Every route chosen with careful measurement, every direction confirmed by compass and terrain mapping, resulted in return to previously visited locations. The cabin reappeared. The clearing reappeared. The ridge reappeared, not as identical recreations, but as recognizable structures that had shifted in subtle ways, as if they had been reassembled rather than rediscovered. The forest itself seemed to maintain continuity while rearranging relational positioning, producing the effect of movement without displacement. Elias began to suspect, though he did not yet fully articulate it in his writing, that they were not navigating through space in the conventional sense anymore. The idea that distance itself might no longer be stable began to form in his observations, though he struggled to express it without abandoning the language of measurement entirely. The problem was not that the instruments failed. It was that the relationship between instrument and environment no longer produced consistent meaning. On the night of the 14th day, the group made camp again near the clearing, though none of them considered it a decision so much as an inevitability. The fire was maintained, though less for comfort now and more as a fixed point of reference against the increasing instability of surroundings. Conversation was minimal. The men had begun to conserve speech not from agreement, but from instinctive reduction of unnecessary input into a system that no longer responded predictably. It was during this night that Elias made his final extended journal entry while still in the hollow. He wrote everything he could recall from the beginning of the expedition, reconstructing each phase with increasing urgency, as though reinforcing continuity through documentation might stabilize what was unraveling around them. He described the initial clarity of the journey, the first subtle deviations in environmental consistency, the clearing with the stones, the cabin, the footsteps along the ridge, the disappearances, and the behavioral shifts. He wrote not only what had happened, but the order in which it had become unexplainable. And then he stopped writing for a long time. When he resumed, the tone had changed again. He wrote that he no longer believed they were being moved through the forest in a linear sense. He wrote that he believed the forest was maintaining them within a structure that was not spatially consistent. That direction, distance, and return were no longer reliable frameworks. He did not claim to understand what replaced them, only that something else appeared to be governing continuity. Just before dawn, something changed. It was not abrupt. It was not dramatic. It was a shift in atmosphere, subtle enough that it could have been mistaken for exhaustion if not for its collective recognition. The sense of pressure that had been present for days, an invisible awareness of being observed, diminished. Not vanished, but eased, as if attention had been withdrawn slightly, not completely, but enough to allow movement without resistance. Elias recorded the change as permission. They broke camp at first light. The walk out of the hollow did not resemble the confusion of previous attempts. There were no loops. No returns to familiar sites. No recalibration of direction required. The forest remained dense, unchanged in physical structure, but now it behaved in accordance with movement rather than resistance. By late afternoon, they reached the outer edge of the region, where terrain became recognizable again, where sound returned to expected distribution, where distance began once again to behave predictably. 4 men emerged. Elias Croft, Dr. Harlan Voss, Tatum, Wesley. Wesley walked in silence, but with awareness that appeared partially detached, as if something of what he had experienced remained active beneath ordinary perception. Tatum did not look back. Dr. Voss said nothing for a long time. Elias did not speak until they were fully beyond the tree line. 5 men did not return. In later records, no official acknowledgement of the expedition exists. Business correspondence from St. Louis denies commissioning it. Maps from the period show no marked survey activity in the region described. The land itself remains recorded, but inconsistently defined, as though its internal structure never fully aligned with external documentation. Elias Croft disappears from all known records several years later. Tatum is later noted by locals as having lived quietly near the edge of the hills until his death, often observed sitting at night facing the direction of the hollow without speaking. Wesley's deposition, filed under a name that does not fully match any known registry, ends with a single passage that remains the most complete surviving account of what occurred. He wrote that what they encountered was not new, that it was not aware of them in the way humans understand awareness, that it had always been there, waiting not in time, but within it, and that when the distance became thin enough, it did not move toward them. It simply allowed them to be close enough to be noticed, not as targets, not as threats, but as something briefly visible through a gap in something much larger than understanding. And then it closed again. By the time the expedition reached what would later be understood as its 3rd stage, although none of them could have named it that in the moment, the forest had stopped behaving like a neutral space entirely and had begun to function more like a closed system that allowed movement, but no longer guaranteed direction. There was still sky above them, still trees around them, still the physical continuity of ground beneath their feet, yet the experience of traveling through it had become increasingly unstable in ways that could not be attributed to fatigue alone. Elias continued to rely on his instruments out of necessity rather than confidence, checking compass readings with greater frequency, marking distances with careful notation, but even his own records began to show inconsistencies that he could not immediately reconcile. A path walked in a straight line over several hours would sometimes return them to terrain that felt familiar in structure but unfamiliar in arrangement, as if the relationship between distance and arrival had been subtly altered without any visible disturbance in the environment itself. It was during this phase that the first full disappearance occurred without ambiguity. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of panic, no physical indication that anything had gone wrong in the immediate sense. One of the men, Fitch, simply was not present when camp was accounted for in the morning. His bedroll remained undisturbed. His equipment was still arranged beside it in the same manner as the previous night. There were no footprints leading away from the site, no signs of forced movement, no disturbances in the surrounding brush that would suggest departure under stress or urgency. It was as if his presence had been removed without interaction, leaving behind only the structure of what had previously been associated with him. The reaction among the remaining men was immediate but controlled, shaped more by confusion than panic at first. Search patterns were established quickly, with experienced coordination, expanding outward from the camp in measured radii, examining terrain features, checking low ground, ridges, tree lines, and potential areas where a man might have fallen or become trapped. Every step of the procedure that should have produced some form of result instead produced none. There were no signs of struggle, no displaced foliage, no broken branches indicating passage. Even calling out yielded no response beyond the natural return of sound through dense forest. The absence of evidence was not partial or ambiguous. It was complete. Elias documented everything with increasing precision, noting not only the lack of physical traces, but the structural impossibility of that lack given the conditions. In terrain of this type, under these environmental conditions, any movement of a human body, especially in low light and uneven ground, should have left some form of detectable signature. Yet there was nothing. That absence began to register not as missing information, but as a form of contradiction within the environment itself. It was after this point that Tatum's behavior shifted more noticeably. He had always been quiet, observant, and measured in movement, but now his attention appeared fixed on something that was not localized to any single point in the landscape. When questioned about Fitch's disappearance, he did not offer speculation. Instead, he spoke in terms that suggested a pattern rather than an event, describing not loss in the conventional sense, but transition. He said there were ways of going missing that did not involve distance or direction, ways that did not leave trails because they did not involve movement across ground in the way people understood movement. His language remained cautious, but the implication was that what had happened to Fitch was not an accident in the terrain, but a condition of the terrain itself. Dr. Voss, maintaining his clinical perspective, attempted to anchor interpretation in physical reality, but even he found no satisfactory explanation. There were no injuries to examine, no remains to analyze, no environmental indicators that would allow for classification under known medical or forensic categories. The absence of evidence was itself becoming the defining characteristic of the situation, and that absence was beginning to affect how even rational observation functioned. On the same day, Elias noted something that he initially struggled to include in his formal record. The compass, while still operational, no longer seemed to correspond cleanly with navigational expectation. It still pointed consistently, but the relationship between direction and outcome had begun to fail in subtle ways. A route that should have led them out of deeper terrain and toward known reference points instead returned them to previously visited locations, including the clearing with the stones and, later, the cabin itself. This recurrence was not immediate or obviously forced. It happened over extended travel, without abrupt shifts in perception, as if the landscape itself had rearranged relational positioning without altering visible structure. By the time they returned to the clearing for the second time, the arrangement of stones had changed. This fact created a silence among the group that was longer than any previous reaction. The stones were not simply displaced or disturbed. They had been reconfigured into a different structure altogether. The original pattern that Elias had recorded on their first visit no longer existed in its prior form. Instead, the stones were now arranged in a configuration that suggested continuity with the previous design while also clearly diverging from it, as if the structure had been revised rather than destroyed. This introduced a disturbing implication. The arrangement was not static. It was responsive. Elias attempted to reconcile this through natural explanations, considering animal interference, environmental shift, or human presence unknown to the group. But none of these possibilities adequately accounted for the level of structural intention required to produce the observed arrangement. The stones had weight, irregular shape, and required deliberate effort to reposition. Yet no tracks, no signs of disturbance, and no indication of human or animal activity were present. Tatum did not examine the stones this time. Instead, he stood at the edge of the clearing for an extended period, his attention fixed not on the structure itself, but on the surrounding forest. When Elias asked him what he was seeing, Tatum responded that the issue was not what was present, but what was no longer fixed. He described the space as if it no longer maintained consistent relation to itself, as though location and meaning were no longer permanently linked. That night, the expedition made camp again near the clearing, though none of them were entirely comfortable with the decision. There was no better option available, as every attempted route away had resulted in circular return patterns that defied expected navigation. Elias did not yet describe this as entrapment in his journal, but the structure of his writing began to reflect increasing uncertainty in directional reliability. He noted that travel paths were no longer producing consistent displacement, and that return to known locations was occurring without identifiable cause. During the night, another change occurred that would later be described by Dr. Voss in his deposition with particular emphasis. Wesley, who had been progressively quieter and more withdrawn since earlier events, was observed sitting upright at an unusual hour, awake but not fully responsive. When spoken to, he answered correctly, but his responses carried a measurable delay that did not correspond to fatigue or sleep interruption. More notably, his gaze did not remain fixed on the person speaking to him, but appeared to pass slightly beyond them, as if attention was being divided between present interaction and something else that remained inaccessible to others in the group. At approximately the same time, Tatum moved away from the fire without explanation and positioned himself at the edge of the camp, facing into the forest. He remained there without speaking or moving for an extended period. Elias observed him but did not interrupt. There was a sense that interruption would be inappropriate, not because of danger, but because of context that was not yet fully visible. Later that night, the sound returned. Footsteps again emerged from the forest below the ridge, matching the same pattern as before, evenly spaced, deliberate, and mechanically consistent in rhythm. The movement followed the same lateral path along the base of the terrain, maintaining a fixed distance from the camp without approaching or retreating. Elias once again attempted to measure interval timing, but found that the consistency of spacing resisted meaningful categorization. The sound lasted longer this time, extending beyond previous duration before ceasing abruptly in the same manner, without fade or transition. After it stopped, the silence that followed felt less like absence of sound and more like retention of presence without expression. By the morning of what would later be identified as the 10th day of this phase, another man was missing. No explanation, no trace, no indication of direction. Only absence again, repeating the same structural pattern as before. And at that point, Elias began to understand that what they were recording was no longer a sequence of isolated incidents, but a repeating condition that was becoming more frequent, more structured, and less dependent on conventional causality. The forest was no longer simply containing them. It was adjusting them.